And we're starting talking about live music because scientists from the University of Manchester have been studying the band Massive Attack's latest tour. Now, they've used the data to come up with a series of recommendations for how to reduce the industry's carbon footprint. Now, the suggestions cover everything from bands swapping private jets for public trains to gig and concert venues using renewable energy. And they think that fans should be offered incentives to travel to events by public transport. So it's an interesting issue, this, isn't it, George Monbiot? But can live music and global tours ever really be green when there's so much power needed to power up the venues and people need to travel sometimes all around the world to get to them?
Well, in principle, they could be pretty good, because if you think about it, you've got tens of thousands, in some cases even hundreds of thousands of people coming to hear a handful of people. And it's only really the handful of people who have to travel long distances. Everyone else can come from the local metropolis. And so you could do it in a really green and sustainable way. Unfortunately, it's often not done like that. And, you see the aftermath of festival sites with just disposable tents scattered all over the place, massive emissions of people traveling to them. Well, full kudos to Massive Attack for asking the climate scientists to do an audit of their touring and to come up with better ways of doing it. And I think what they've created here is a template that other bands can now use, and it should become a global standard for concerts.
Yeah, I'd be really interested to see if any bands do get on the train to get to their own gigs. That'll be an interesting one. But, Juliet, the issue of how the audience gets there is a big one, isn't it? Let's take a look here at one of the facts that came out of the report. It said that audience travel makes up the largest proportion of live music-related emissions. So, Juliet, should people think twice about travelling to gigs because of the impact on the planet?
I think it'd be hard pushed to say to people you can't go have your fun at a festival because of that. I think the words that you use that are so relevant are incentivized. And I think we just generally, as with any sector or anything we're talking about in terms of looking at people's sort of emissions, is the transparency. What if they could have a certification? Each band had some sort of certification showing how much they had either saved or what their carbon emissions were, and they had people could judge it like that. And also, as George says, really with festivals, it's about the wake and all that disposability that's left. And as we know, with the pandemic and COVID and the health and safety protocols, that's made it much, much worse. So I would just love to see more transparency and certification marks across everything, whether it's live music, in terms of people's emissions.
But it's not just about transparency, is it, George Monbiot? It's about actual action. You've got bands travelling all around the world with a huge amount of kit being transported as well. I mean, they could just stream one live concert to everybody, couldn't they? I mean, should we just clamp down on this?
I mean, I'm not against having live events. I think they're really important. They bring people together, and people have got to have fun. And, God knows we've spent enough time sitting in our own homes having vicarious fun. So, but in principle, it could be a pretty low impact way to do it. You talk about trucking all that kit around. Why? Why are bands trucking all that kit around? Why don't they hire the kit locally? And help local businesses by hiring the kit that they have on offer. And as Massive Attack point out, it's fundamentally the same kit. There's not a big difference between the kit that you'll truck halfway around the world and the kit that you'll hire locally. And private jets, absolutely out. I've seen too many bands talk about all their green commitments and how we recycle and how we do this, and it turns out that they travel by private jet. It's just outrageous. And I mean, I want to see all private jets banned, simple as that. So absolutely, minimize the emissions as much as possible, but let's not stop live events, because I think they're really important, particularly for young people.
OK, well, let's talk about the flying aspect. George Monbiot there saying, Juliet, we should ban private jets. What about the impact that flying has? This is very much your area. I mean, a huge amount of carbon emissions. One flight from London to New York emits 1 tonne of CO2 per passenger, and there are normally around 2,500 flights every day. That is a huge amount. Do we need to do something about that pretty promptly?
Absolutely. I mean, we all know that by getting on a plane, that's going to be the biggest contribution to our own personal footprints. And only 11% of the world is actually flying, and those who are suffering and on the front line of the results of a climate emergency are definitely not those flying. And I think it's really important, to remember that the top 1% of the world, the ones who are taking the private jets, I've certainly never been on a private jet, they're responsible for double the combined carbon emissions of the poorest 50%. So I think they're the ones we have to look at. And going back to when I said, the transparency and having the certification, imagine if everyone had to wear, what their personal emissions were. And I think, in terms of aviation, just to put it in context, though, absolutely, we should be flying less. I'm all for frequent flyer taxes. But if aviation as a sector were a country, it would only be the 20th worst offending of all the countries in the world. So just to put it in context. And there's obviously, I advocate there's lots of good that comes from international travel. It's just being mindful of that. We need it for wealth distribution. We need it because 1 in 10 people in the world is employed in tourism. It's a great way of sending money from the countries and the people who have it to those who don't.
OK, we'll have a whole other... Go on, George, I can see you're dying to get in. A very quick word before we move on to the next subject.
I mean, as Juliet rightly says, there is this massive disparity in the amount that people fly, but it really is worth emphasising that the great majority of flights, not just on private jets and ordinary jets, are taken by very rich people, often to their second homes, often many times a year. We need to tax that very heavily with frequent flyer taxes so that those who take a lot of flights have to pay a lot of money for it, and that hopefully will discourage it to a considerable extent.